Ever try to make something better and it blows up in your face, like completely backfires?
Yeah, I've had a few DIY projects go that way.
Totally. It's like good intentions, but the result, disaster. That's kind of the vibe we're diving into today, but on a historical scale. Think British rule in India.
Now that's a recipe for some serious unintended consequences.
You said it. We're cracking open the books, the reports, even some first-hand accounts from back in the day. And get this. The very policies the British put in place to maintain control, they basically handed India the blueprint for a revolution.
It's funny how history works like that, isn't it? You try to hold on to something too tight and it slips right through your fingers.
So let's start with the East India Company. We all know they weren't just there for the tea and spices, right?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, sure, it all started with trade. But things escalated quickly. That whole spice trade image, it glosses over the part where they went from business partners to, well, imperial rulers.
And that's where the trouble really began.
You could say that. One of the biggest game changers was their land revenue system. Every government needs taxes, sure. But the British system, it hit Indian farmers like a ton of bricks.
I'm guessing this wasn't just a pay your fair share kind of situation.
Not even close.
Yeah.
The British wanted cash crops, things like indigo, which they used for dyes, and cotton for textiles. Problem is, you can't feed a family on indigo.
So, farmers were being forced to grow crops they couldn't even eat themselves.
Precisely. Imagine you're a farmer who's been growing food for generations, and suddenly you're being told to prioritize crops that only benefit a foreign power thousands of miles away. The economic hardship was bad enough, but it also led to widespread food shortages.
It's like a lose-lose situation for the Indian people, right?
Sadly, yes. And it wasn't just the land revenue system. Let's not forget about the railways.
The railways.
Yeah.
But weren't those supposed to be a sign of progress?
That's how the British spun it, of course.
Yeah.
But the reality, those railways were primarily built to serve British economic interests. They needed a way to get those cash crops out of India and into British factories as quickly and cheaply as possible. Meanwhile, Indian industries were being stifled. Economists call this the drain of wealth. Essentially, India's own resources were being used against it.
It's giving major robbery under the guise of progress vibes.
Exactly. And while the economic side of things is definitely a big part of the story, we can't forget about the social reforms. Even when the British tried to do something that seemed like a good idea, it often backfired.
You mean like with sati?
Yeah.
I read about that. Pretty horrifying stuff.
It was a horrific practice, no question. But the way the British went about abolishing it, without any real understanding of the cultural context, well, it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way.
It's that thing where even if your intentions are good, barging in and imposing your values on another culture never really goes well, does it?
Never. And then there's the whole issue of education.
Right, because introducing Western education to India, that seems like it should be a good thing, at least on the surface.
In theory, sure. But it was also a way for the British to assert their own cultural dominance and create a class of Indians who were more likely to, shall we say, toe the line.
So education becomes this double-edged sword. On one hand, it opens doors, but on the other hand, it reinforces the existing power structure.
Precisely. And speaking of reinforcing the power structure, let's talk about the Indian Civil Service exam.
Oh yeah, that was messed up.
The fact that Indians had to travel all the way to Britain to take an exam in English just to have a shot at serving in their own government, that's a special kind of insult.
Talk about sending a message.
Yeah.
And not a very subtle one either.
Not at all. And you have to remember, all of this is happening against the backdrop of the economic exploitation we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Plus those social reforms that felt more like cultural impositions. You can see how resentment would start to build.
It's like they were piling on injustice after injustice.
Exactly. And then, as if to make absolutely sure a rebellion was brewing, they introduced policies like the doctrine of lapse.
Okay, so for those of us who need a history refresher, what was that all about?
It was basically a way for the British to annex independent Indian states if the ruler died without a male heir. Imagine a prosperous kingdom thriving under the leadership of a wise queen. But because she doesn't have a son, the British could just swoop in and take it over.
So much for respecting a woman's authority. And what about the Vernacular Press Act? That doesn't sound great either.
It wasn't. The British clamped down on any newspapers or publications that dared to criticize their rule, particularly those in Indian languages.
Control the narrative, control the people. Classic move. Did it work?
Well, you know what they say about the Streisand effect.
I think I see where you're going with this.
The more you try to suppress something, the more attention it gets. And so instead of silencing dissent, The Vernacular Press Act had the opposite effect. It just fueled the fire.
And this is where figures like Raja Ram Mohan Roy come into the picture, right?
Absolutely. He was a true visionary, advocating for social change within India while also fiercely condemning the injustices of British rule.
He's fighting on two fronts at once. That's amazing. How did he manage that?
Raja Ram Mohan Roy understood that true progress required both internal reform and liberation from external control. He challenged traditional practices like sati, but he also recognized the need for a free and independent India. His life embodies the complex legacy of this era. Because while British rule in India was undeniably oppressive and exploitative, it also inadvertently fostered a sense of Indian nationalism that would ultimately lead to independence.
So it's kind of a bittersweet thing. Out of all that darkness and injustice, a new sense of identity and purpose emerged.
Exactly. And it teaches us a valuable lesson. The law of unintended consequences is always in effect. Sometimes, even the most carefully crafted plans can backfire spectacularly and create something entirely new and unexpected.
It makes you wonder, what unintended consequences are we setting in motion today? What seemingly small decisions might have huge ripple effects down the line?
That's a question worth pondering, isn't it?